Welcome to California Frontier, the show about the often overlooked and unexpected early history of the place we call California. I'm your host, Damian. A royal order of His Majesty, sent by His Excellency the Marqués de Grimaldi of the Council and First Secretary of State, under date of the 23rd of January of 1768, to the Most Excellent Señor Marqués de Croix, Viceroy of this kingdom, imparting definite knowledge of the attempts which the Russians have made to facilitate their communication with this America, warned His Excellency to dispatch instructions and orders to the Governor of California to observe from there the designs of that nation and to frustrate them as far as possible, a copy of which His Excellency the Viceroy had passed on to the Lord Visitor General, so that, being fully acquainted with it and putting into practice the former plans of occupancy with a presidio at Puerto de Monterrey, situated on the Great Ocean, on the west coast of California, he might adopt those measures he deems most expedient in order to explore by land and by sea, so that having taken exact observations and having made a map of the harbor, the useful project of establishing ourselves at that place may be accomplished. At the same time, it was also agreed that it would be most important to undertake an entry or search by land at the proper seasons for the missions to the north of California, so that both expeditions might unite at the same harbor of Monterey, and by means of the observations made by one and the other, they might acquire once and for all complete knowledge, and in this way aid greatly the founding of a presidio and settlement at that place, which is truly the most advantageous for protecting the entire west coast of California and the other coasts of the southern part of this continent against any attempts by the Russians or any northern nation. And that is a quote from the record of a meeting that took place at San Blas in Mexico in 1768 that described the first effort to really settle what is today known as the state of California, and at the time was known as Alta California or Nueva New California. And in fact, when they refer in this text to the governor of California, they are referring to Antigua or Baja California, which the Spanish had settled in the 1600s. This quote comes from the book Lands of Promise and Despair, Chronicles of Early California, 1535 to 1846, and edited by Rosemary Beebe and Robert M. Sienkiewicz. And today I'm going to give a brief overview of those efforts to establish a settlement in Alta California and who those people were who eventually came north and settled in that region of the world and who eventually became known as the Californios. Once Spanish officials had made the decision to establish a military presence on the coast of Alta California, they soon began to realize that a military presence could never be enough to secure the area. Although a presidio was a self-contained community, it was a frontier outpost, and it would never be large enough to fully support itself. What they needed were towns that could supply the presidios with food and other provisions. And towns needed families. The Spanish Crown's plan was for the native communities on the missions to eventually transform themselves into towns, as had happened in many places in Latin America previously. Nevertheless, transforming a mission into a town took many years. And with the Russians and also the English planning to settle along the Pacific coast, Spanish officials felt the need to speed up the process. And even though some Spanish soldiers had married native women from the missions, these couples were few in number. So the governor of California, Felipe de Neve, created a plan to bring more families to the territory. Part of this plan was to find a way to transport people and supplies to Alta California by land, so that the settlements would not only be dependent on ships, so that the settlements would not be solely dependent on ships and sea routes up the turbulent coastline. Governor Neve set out to attract people from what is today northern Mexico to travel north and establish themselves in Alta California near the presidios and missions, forming towns like the ones in the rest of Latin America. The first group that came north was led by the intrepid military commander Juan Bautista de Anza, who, by the way, was profiled in an earlier episode of this podcast. If you go back and listen, you can find the episode about Juan Bautista de Anza, who, thanks to the help of native guide Sebastián Tarabal and Chief Salvador Palma, had opened up a land route from what is today southern Arizona all the way to northern California. Along with a group of over 200 men, women, and children, they left in 1775 and traveled overland, reaching the San Francisco Bay region in 1776 and founding the Presidio of San Francisco that year. Soon after, Governor Neve instructed José Joaquín Moraga, Anza's right-hand man and newly appointed commander of the Presidio of San Francisco, to bring a small group of families to establish a town about 50 miles south of there, along the banks of what the Spanish named the Guadalupe River. On November 29, 1777, they founded the pueblo, or town of San José de Guadalupe, named after Moraga's patron saint, Saint Joseph. San Jose would be the first civil settlement in Alta California and evolve into what is today a city of over 1 million inhabitants. Governor Neve, not content with the amount of agricultural production from the pueblo of San Jose, soon ordered the formation of another group of colonists. He asked military commander Fernando de Rivera y Moncada to recruit another group of settlers and soldiers from the provinces of Sonora and Sinaloa. They would come north with him, following the trail Anza had used. In 1781, Rivera arrived with 14 families and 60 soldiers, and they settled near the banks of the Porciúncula River, which is today known as the Los Angeles River, near the San Gabriel Mission. There, they founded the Pueblo of Los Angeles, the second civilian town in Alta California, and eventually the largest city on the West Coast. These two pueblos would be the last large-scale settlements that were attempted in Spanish Alta California, since the land route from northern Sonora that Anza and Rivera had taken became closed soon after. Nevertheless, in 1797, Governor Diego de Borica was able to bring 7 or 8 families to found what was called the Villa de Branciforte, near Mission Santa Cruz. Unlike San Jose and Los Angeles, Branciforte was beset by difficulties from its founding and was eventually disbanded. The last organized settlement took place in Mexican Alta California, with the arrival of the Híjar Padres Party in 1834, which was not well received by the established settlers and was also eventually disbanded. The families that came to settle in Alta California might not have known how important they were to Spanish strategic goals, but they all came with a thirst to start a new and better life for themselves and for their children. Most came from the territories of... It was especially during the 15th century, when Spain became a unified nation, that the pattern for establishing towns was truly solidified. The first towns in California were established during the reign of King Carlos III, the King of Spain, who had a keen sense of the importance of towns. Towns like San Jose and Los Angeles were generally arranged as a series of houses, and for many years they were mainly huts, organized around a central plaza. There would also be a church nearby. Each family was provided a piece of land, called a solar, in the town on which to build a house, as well as a piece of land outside of town, called a suerte, in which to raise crops. Just outside of the town, there were community lands to be used to graze livestock or for other purposes. The town's affairs were overseen by an alcalde, who was both a mayor and a judge, together with a town council called the cabildo or the ayuntamiento. This was a typical arrangement in Spanish towns since the Middle Ages. And since towns on the California frontier were expected to supply food to the presidio, the army played an important role in governing the town. Often, there would be a commissioner or comisionado who represented the military authorities in town governance. A comisionado, for example, could even veto the election of an alcalde or members of the cabildo. In accordance with the need to work the land, daily life in towns and settlements followed an agricultural rhythm, similar to that of the native people at the missions. Families would wake up early and share a meal of atole, a type of porridge made from corn, and usually prepared by the women. After breakfast, the men and the older boys would go to work tending the ranchos or farms. The duties would change depending on the seasons. If the rancho was larger or the family was more well off, they would also have the help of Indians who would be hired to work as cowboys, vaqueros, or farmhands. While the men were working in the fields, women would attend to tasks around the home. Though, depending on the time of year and the necessity, they would also work in the fields. Around midday, everyone would take a break for a meal and a siesta and return to work around 3 p.m. until sunset, after which time they would have supper. Children participated fully in the labors of the pueblo, doing tasks and chores that were considered suitable to their age. As they grew older, their responsibilities increased, and by the time they were teenagers, they would carry out most of the adult tasks. Where possible, children attended school, especially the boys. However, on the frontier, this was not always possible, especially for the poorer families. So it was common for children to grow up not knowing how to read and write. It was also not unusual for children to grow up speaking Spanish and also the local native languages due to the frequent contact with Indian people. Children also grew up aware of the dangers of frontier life. Because of the lack of doctors on the frontier, infectious diseases could sweep through communities. Children were especially vulnerable to these illnesses, and many families lost young children to epidemics. Life in frontier pueblos could be risky for other reasons. Alta California was home to a number of large predators, including grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolves, not to mention smaller dangerous animals such as rattlesnakes, which we still deal with commonly today. Adults had to be constantly on guard for such animals, and men always went around armed with lances, knives, and on more rare occasions, muskets or pistols. Settlers' relations with local native tribes could also turn violent, especially when natives who were resentful of the Spanish presence on their traditional lands or believed they were being exploited would attack settlements or steal livestock and horses. Despite the dangerous nature of frontier life, settlers also knew how to enjoy themselves. People would pass their free time telling stories and jokes and singing. Many could play an instrument like the guitar. Whenever there was an occasion, families would organize parties that would last late into the night with music and many types of dances. Wedding celebrations would last for days, and since everyone knew each other and were joined by family bonds, everyone in the local area would attend. Often, men would display their horsemanship skills through various types of competitions and events. More violent types of frontier entertainment were also well liked. Bullfights were especially popular, as they were all over Spain and Latin America. A particular type of frontier amusement was the bear and bull fight, where a bear and a bull were tied together and made to battle each other. In addition to the small parcels of land that each settler received, from time to time the government would grant larger tracts to soldiers who had retired and served with distinction. These lands would become ranchos, and the soldiers would receive cattle and horses, and would plant crops such as wheat and barley. After Mexican independence, and especially after the missions were secularized or shut down, the number of retired soldiers and settlers who received land grants multiplied. And many of the names of cities and towns in California are derived from the names of these ranchos. In time, soldiers, settlers, and their descendants began to develop a unique culture in Alta California. The fact that Alta California remained fairly isolated contributed to a sense of pride at their uniqueness among Hispanic residents. They came to call themselves Californios, or hijos del país, sons of the land. Some of the hallmarks of this special Californio culture were hospitality and welcoming towards strangers and travelers, a great respect for the value of family relationships, and a strong sense of self-reliance. Californio culture was also a horse culture. Young children learned to ride from an early age. Visitors to Alta California often commented about the fine horsemanship of the Californios. Visitor Richard Henry Dana, in his book 2 Years Before the Mast, said, quote, "There are probably no better riders in the world. They are put on a horse when they are only 4 or 5 years old. Their little legs not long enough to come halfway over the sides." Unquote. Despite their sense of local pride, Californios generally saw themselves as loyal members of the Spanish Empire. Later, they accepted Mexican independence from Spain and swore allegiance to the new country. According to testimonies from Californios later in the 19th century, their lives did not change a great deal with the new government, at least initially. With time, however, a growing sense of estrangement from the central government began to take root, especially among the more prominent members of Californio society. The distance from the capital in Mexico City, the geographical isolation, and the sense of resentment towards government meddling in local affairs began to make themselves felt more strongly amongst the people who had grown up in Alta California. In the 1840s, resistance to the imposition of governors from the outside became violent. California-born hijos del país, such as Juan Alvarado, Pio Pico, and Jose Castro, led an uprising against Mexican-born governor and Army General Manuel Michel Torena. After a series of confrontations, Michel Torena eventually left the territory. This resulted in the naming of Pio Pico as governor of Alta California in 1845. Although the Californios asserted their identity against what they saw as interference by the Mexican government, they never declared independence from Mexico. During the 1840s, though, Alta California, with its excellent weather, fertile land, and hospitable inhabitants, became the object of great interest for Anglo-Americans from further east. Throughout the 19th century, Californios had generally been very welcoming of immigrants, especially those who were willing to settle in the area and marry into local families. Most of these men had come by ship from the East Coast, and they had assimilated into Californio society. They learned Spanish and adopted Roman Catholicism as their religion. By the mid-1840s, however, the number of Americans entering the territory increased exponentially, and many were not willing to be absorbed into Californio society. With the success of Texas's separation from Mexico and its inclusion into the U.S., many newcomers saw this as a viable model for Alta California, too. When war broke out between the U.S. and Mexico in 1846, immigrants from the U.S. who hoped to take Alta California from Mexico had the full backing of U.S. military power. President James K. Polk sent the U.S. Army and the U.S. Navy to seize control of Alta California. Many Californios fought hard against the American takeover. Others believed it better to adapt to U.S. rule, as they had adapted to Mexican rule. No matter which side they chose, the war was over fairly soon. By the end of 1846, Mexican Californians were under military occupation. In 1848, the U.S. and Mexico signed the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which ceded a large part of the territory of northern Mexico to the United States. The years immediately following the conclusion of hostilities between the U.S. and Mexico were particularly challenging to Californios. With the discovery of gold in the Sierra foothills, hundreds of thousands of treasure seekers and prospectors flooded into the territory. Very soon, California's Hispanic residents were in the vast minority. After having been the dominant class of people in the territory since the 18th century, Hispanic Californians now found themselves on the margins, culturally, linguistically, and economically. Their land holdings became the target of squatters and unscrupulous real estate speculators. They found themselves struggling to defend their interests. Without understanding the U.S. legal system, they often had to rely on unscrupulous lawyers to defend them. Many families didn't have cash, so despite their large land holdings, they wound up selling off portions of their land simply to be able to pay their legal bills. By the 1870s, many California families had lost everything. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo offered full citizenship rights to Alta California's Hispanic residents. Nevertheless, Mexican Californians were often viewed with suspicion by their neighbors. They were labeled as lazy or shifty or uncivilized. Much of this stemmed from the language barrier that existed between both groups. Most Californios did not speak English, and very few of the new immigrants spoke Spanish. Nevertheless, most Mexican Californians did their best to adapt to the new circumstances. Many of their children became fluent in English and even married Anglo-Americans. Some of the more prominent families, such as the Picos and the Vallejos, were able to retain some of their land holdings and even become active in public service. In the early 20th century, Californians began to develop an interest in their state's Spanish heritage as they saw it. Some of it stemmed from the popularity of novels, such as Helen Hunt Jackson's Ramona. Her novel sought to highlight injustices against California's Indian population and looked fondly on the Hispanic past. Some of it was undoubtedly due to the successive waves of immigrants, many of whom wanted to show that California was not only a place for the descendants of Northern Europeans. Cities, such as Santa Barbara, began to organize festivals and parades. Today, thousands of people can claim Californio ancestry. There are organizations such as Los Californianos that aid descendants in researching their ancestry and maintaining pride in their family histories. They organize events and actively participate in commemorations of early California history. They often serve as docents at historical sites or fight to maintain and preserve historical buildings, monuments, and artifacts. Through their efforts, they remind people of the rich heritage of the early settlers of the California frontier. I hope you enjoyed this episode of the California Frontier Show. If you'd like to support the show, the best thing to do is to let other people know about it. If you'd like to support it monetarily, there are a couple ways of doing that. One is by scrolling down in your podcast app to where it says support the show. There you can become a subscriber for as little as $3 a month. And if you want to give a one-time donation, just below you'll see where it says give a one-time donation. Finally, the show is supported by California History Teachers, which is a full year of lessons for 4th grade California history and social studies. You can find out more at www.californiahistoryteachers.com. And if you input the coupon code PODCAST, you'll receive 25% off your monthly or annual subscription. So check it out.